Hello and welcome to The Wizard and the Priestess. Today is just your host, The Wizard, as Nuala is quite selfishly, I might add, being a mum. So I'm holding the fort strong today. And today I'm going to talk to you about a lot of conversations I have in clinic. And I think this episode will cover a lot of that. And it always seems to start with either pain or diet. Now, the two are very, very intimately linked. And pain often presents itself as a long story told short, meaning the onset of pain usually comes years and years and years, perhaps even decades before you actually feel, the big pain itself or even the diagnosis itself. So this can go for any injury, any kind of joint pains, soft tissue, any kind of disease. We are in a state of dis-ease. This conversation today can address all of it, absolutely all of it. So it usually starts with diet. Diet when we're a teenager, diet when we're a kid. A lot of us weren't fed optimally, and that's not necessarily, let's say, the parents' fault. Maybe the parents didn't know any better, or the child was so quote unquote convincing that they just wanted to eat junk. And I was the same. Most of us were the same as well. Kids love junk, so it's easier just to give the kids junk sometimes, especially when I was growing up. So all of these foods, high in sugar, high in processed, God knows what, all the chemicals, they are very hormonally disruptive, and that affects us throughout our entire life. How we eat as a teenager metabolically sets us up for the rest of our lives. As a teenager, you don't really care because you're indestructible and you know everything. So not a huge priority, but when you grow up, you realize how important nutrition really is. But it can start as a teenager, not only through diet. Think of all the sports you played or the hobbies you did. All of these things contribute, and they actually start to physically degenerate joints. They start to weaken soft tissues. If you played any kind of contact sport as a kid, or if you were did a lot of dynamic movements, running, riding, etc., that puts excess mechanical tension through the musculoskeletal system. And unless you've been core conditioned properly, and that starts, well, technically it starts in the womb, but it goes through the infant development process of crawling and walking. Unless you did that sequence correctly and kept your core function going optimally throughout the teenage years, then there's a good chance that you weren't evenly dissipating tension throughout the musculoskeletal system. So what that usually looks like is joint degeneration. Now, again, I played rugby league growing up, so quite a tough contact sport. So what can happen as early as 16, 17, 18, 19 years of age, you can start putting adverse mechanical tension through a certain aspect of the disc. Now, you add poor diet onto that, you add poor mechanics onto that, poor posture. So all of a sudden, you lose the mechanism. One of its main functions from a movement perspective is to evenly dissipate tension throughout the musculoskeletal system. So the force typically comes from the ground, comes up through the knees and the hips. If it is not evenly distributed, or if it has not had the elasticity that the tissues have, if you've lost that, then it goes straight into the joint. It can even go up the spine into the neck, the shoulder, the elbow, etc. So that starts to create a compensatory pattern. This compensatory pattern isn't usually recognized till later in life, until 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe even 60s. But it starts as a teenager. So the pain story itself is usually quite a long story, unfortunately. But luckily, hopefully today can help a little bit. So with a long story of, let's say, pain, everyone has their own subconscious strategy, meaning all of our systems are built individually. All of our systems operate individually. My body doesn't work the same as someone else's body, and vice versa. So we all have our little patterns that we develop in life. Now, if you look at limping, for an example, it can be anything to do with any of the toes, any part of the foot, the ankle, maybe even the knee, potentially even the hip. You start to develop a limp. Now, that limp is your body's way of compensating. The body doesn't like pain, so it's going to develop this limp in an attempt to avoid the pain. So it's rather intelligent. Now, with that limp, you look at someone walking normally, that's their motor pattern, their neurological motor pattern. When they start to develop a limp, they start to develop a new neurological motor pattern, motor meaning movement. That becomes an engram in the system. An engram is essentially movement software for the body. Now, when this movement software starts to alter, it only takes 300 to 500 repetitions for that to become ingrained within the software that the body is now using to compensate against the pain. Now, sometimes it's a great big, huge, noticeable compensation. Sometimes it's very, very subtle. And we often don't recognize the subtle compensations at the conscious level because we're busy going throughout our day and doing our thing. The big compensations are, the limps, or not being able to use our arms properly to reach up to the top shelf. So maybe we will use our back. If we can't raise our arms up, we tend to extend from the lower back in order to get the job done, because the body doesn't know of individual muscles. It only knows of movement, and the brain will get the movement done no matter what. I mean, within pain restrictions. So a lot of pain can be a long story. It can be traced back to early childhood. It can be even traced back to the womb. Now, when we start crawling as an infant, we start crawling along the ground, which starts to integrate the head and the tail, which are limbs 1 and 6. Through this serpentine movement, we start to create an environment, because essentially what we need to do as adults eventually is to handle ourselves in gravity. So when we're in pain, essentially what's happening is your body saying, I can't effectively dissipate gravity any longer. So this joint or this tissue, something is going to hurt. And again, your body will move in an attempt to avoid that pain. So hopefully you can see the logic in that. However, if we miss the crawling process, if we miss crawling like a lizard on the ground, we don't integrate the left and the right hemispheres of the body. We don't stimulate the acupressure points on the forearms, hands, inner thigh, and feet to create the reptilian response. The reptilian response is what we have as a brainstem, which is our reactive brainstem. Now, a lot of people didn't crawl, so that becomes their default setting, not only within movement, but their attitude towards life. They're always in a fight or flight state. That's someone typical stuck in their lower energy centers or their chakras, but it's also someone who is very reactive and not active in their own life. So they perceive everything as a threat. That's how the body can mirror itself in the mind. If an infant doesn't crawl on the ground like a cat or a dog, then they don't stimulate the acupressure points in those parts of the bodies, in the shins, the hands, the knees, etc. then those points stimulate the limbic system, which is our part of the brain that processes emotion. Now, if we can't process emotion, then you can see how that could be tricky during a traumatic event in life. And it's easy for the nervous system to get stuck in that particular, space-time event. So their psychological development would stop. Their body will continue to grow chronologically, but neurologically and psychologically, they act and react from that first perceived trauma. Now, all of this builds up into the musculoskeletal system. For a really good read and understanding how the musculoskeletal system, in particular the skeleton, actually portrays our unconscious psychological state. Now, the book by Jean-Pierre Barral, Understanding the Messages of Your Joints, gives a really good in-depth view of all the joints and what they actually represent. So just an example, someone presenting with shoulder pain. They haven't been in an accident. They just woke up one day, went through an event, and their shoulders started to hurt. Then the shoulders represent having the weight of the world on your shoulders psychologically. Shoulders also represent a high correlation emotionally of not letting go of something or someone. And every patient I've spoken to who's had frozen shoulder resonates with that statement about not letting go. They're holding on to something all the time. But statistically, the biggest cause of frozen shoulders is really over-treatment. And a lot of allied healthcare professionals will go to a physio or a chiro and they'll try their best to mobilize the shoulder socket, not realizing they're doing more harm than good. But often I find in the shoulder, for an example, if it's the right shoulder that's frozen, there's a lot of tension in the liver. That liver communicates to the right shoulder capsule via the phrenic nerves. The phrenic nerve is one of those nerves in the body so the phrenic nerve, which also innervates the diaphragm and comes from your neck, C345, it picks up the tension and holds the tension. But if the tension is too much for the nerve itself, it will dissipate it into tissue. So you might end up with neck pain, shoulder pain, breathing dysfunction, any number of things. So one person going through the same two people going through the same traumatic effect, one might end up with frozen shoulder, the other one might be neck pain, or the other one might have breathing issues just for that reason. So that's what I mean when I'm saying we all have our own subconscious strategy to help dissipate the stress. Kind of joints mean what? But the most common I've seen recently is lower back and shoulder. Lower back usually has anything to do with any kind of pressure in life, rhythm. How's your biological rhythm? Are you sleeping? Are you going with the flow of life, or are you trying to, control things that aren't really in your control? For example, what other people think or feel about you. We often hold in the lower back. Also, any kind of stresses with safety, security. So that usually translates to money stuff, bills, mortgage, etc. Also, pressure in relationships, which is a big one for a lot of people. And we hold all that tension in the lower back. Now, your skeleton is the cosmic antenna for these ideas. To the degree that you have something caught in your mental field, i.e. a thought that just keeps repeating itself over and over and it's not shared out loud, you hold on to it. We hold the energy of that idea into certain parts of the tissue. That's where the chakras come in really helpful to know all about. In my clinical experience, I've probably had a good 85 to 90% correlation between where they're feeling their pain and the psychological themes going on in their life according to the chakra systems. If we're staying on the physical today, then another good book for anyone with lower back pain is Treat Your Own Back by Robin McKenzie. Now, I'm sure most people have heard of the McKenzie press, or they've had a back issue sometime in life and they've been told to arch their back. So that's a McKenzie method. I think Robin McKenzie was a Kiwi physio, I believe. Now, as we go from the joints, we also, one of the most overlooked aspects of pain is the role that the organs play. Now, people might only think of an organ as something that has to do with their immunity or just their breathing or their metabolism, digestion, etc. However, there's a whole field called traditional Chinese medicine where they show that organs are the antenna for our emotions and our mind themes. Every time we think a thought, there's usually a feeling associated with it. So that feeling, depending on the psychological theme, will be held in the organ corresponding to that psychological theme. So, for example, a lot of anger, angst, bursts of frustration we hold into the liver. We also perceive our own, if we are in our own perception a prisoner to our own routine, we'll hold that into the liver. Also, the imago. The imago is Latin for image, and it's most commonly referred to as the imago Dei, or image of deity, or your belief of what, who and what, where you think God is. Now, even if you're not religious, there's that question, where do we all come from? The answer to that question is held in the liver. Most of the word live makes up the liver. And our deep perception and relationship between us and ourselves, the person you see in the mirror is held in the liver. So it's your deep sense of self. So we hold that, all that in there, mainly as we're the ones perceiving it. So regardless of what anyone says, we're the one perceiving our own life. So to the degree we're not happy with our life and we feel stuck, a prisoner into that, then we will often show up with liver symptoms. Then with the liver, you can develop things, little behavioral things, lack of self-esteem, hard time to know yourself, little phobias, often bad moods, pessimism, have just a lack of fighting spirit, absence or a decrease of creativity. All these are really liver symptoms. Now, that's just, I guess, psychological. The viscerosomatic reflexes of the liver can be right sacroiliac, right shoulder pain, pain around the bottom of the shoulder blades, neck pain, usually on the right, cranial base restrictions up at the occiput, where the occiput meets the C1, the atlas, or the OA junction, the occipito-atlanto junction. A lot of tension there. Temporal headaches can often be caused by the liver. But most people go chasing the symptoms. They don't take the time and energy to investigate deeper things into what's going on. So what I'm really sharing with you today is you can see how the long story starts to form and it starts to play itself out. The first thing you need to do is make the story conscious. Well, our lives are our story. So it doesn't have to be a negative connotation attached to it. It's how you perceive the world, how you perceive yourself is your story. So most people are holding on to something or someone. And what I tell my patients, one of the first questions I ask is, can you forgive? And forgiving might be the most illogical thing that you can do in this existence, because according to our own hearts, we're the only ones that have ever been hurt. But then I'll put the question to people, Well, how many people around the world are in therapy just because they met you? A great book I would recommend for not only forgiveness, but just to more see the bigger picture in how the whole thing plays out and how it affects you, is Why People Don't Heal and How They Can by Carolyn Miss. I've done a lot of study with Carolyn Miss, and she's an absolutely powerful woman. So forgiveness, again, it's one of the most logical things that we can do, but it's also the most selfish, meaning that if there's a thing between me and someone else and I'm not forgiving them, then it's like me giving the other person poison, but then me being poisoned by it. So it doesn't make a lot of sense when you kind of speak it out loud, and holding a grudge against someone literally eats you alive. And even though you might have done nothing wrong, they're the villain and you're the victim, you're still half of that relationship. And that relationship still has energy. And until you learn how to forgive, then there's still an energetic thing there. That thing has energy that attracts matter to it, and it creates reality. And it's mostly at the unconscious level. But you'll know, we've all had the experience of being in someone's presence and really not wanting to be in that person's presence. But then when you can see that person for who and what they really are, then you'll find it's quite hard to get angry, because you can get to a point where you can see them in their trauma and realize what they must have gone through and what is going on in their own mind. Once you can see, most people are often stuck in their child archetype. So really, if you're holding a grudge against someone, then typically that's you being angry at a child, which then doesn't make a lot of sense if you really think about it, because the child doesn't really know what they're doing and they're not really that conscious compared to an adult, in theory. Now, one of the other questions I often get told, and people seem to ask this at the very end of a session, so I'm hopefully going to answer that now, is the question, or the answer to the question of what should I eat? Now, if you go to any doctor, therapist, including naturopath, nutritionist, and they tell you what to eat without doing any kind of analysis, run. Because we all have our own biochemical individuality, which means my calcium needs are different to your calcium needs. Your needs for zinc or potassium would be completely different to mine. We all have our genetic requirements, and our nutritional needs are often based on our genetics, our ancestry, where we came from. I'm not a big diet guy. However, if I was to recommend one diet, which isn't really kind of a diet, it would be, first of all, noticing what you can actually effectively digest, assimilate, metabolize, and eliminate without creating inflammation. Inflammation shows up in many different ways, including fatigue, brain fog, pain, bloating, the list goes on. In fact, there's a lot of experts in holistic health saying you're not tired, you're just inflamed. So if you want to know what your diet, quote unquote, should look like, and you can customize it to yourself, read the book, The Metabolic Typing Diet by William Walcott and Trish Fahey, Fahey, however you pronounce that. But in this book, there's a comprehensive questionnaire to determine what your plate should look like in regards to the ratios of protein, fat, carbohydrate. essentially whatever you eat in specific ratios will determine how much physical, mental, emotional, even spiritual energy you have for the next couple of hours. So a good balanced meal for your body type and your metabolic type should give you enough energy for anywhere from 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 hours. And that will often go against any government dietary plan that you'll see. In fact, a lot of nutritional experts say that the food pyramid in the West is completely upside down. And in fact, that's actually how they feed cows to get them fat. And cows need to be fat for the farmers because a lot of the meat sold commercially and commercially farmed meat will actually, they might feed a bit of grass, but they'll put lots of grain into their diet. The grain will inflame the animal because cows aren't designed to eat grain. It inflames the tissue, they get slaughtered. We eat the inflamed tissue and wonder why we're tired and sick all the time. So that's one example of how the food industry kind of works behind the scenes. If you can get something like a grass-fed, grass-finished animal, then at least you know that animal's eaten what it's designed to eat through its life. And it's funny how there's no obesity or a lot of the diseases humans have in the animal kingdom. There's an old saying, don't feed giraffes meat, don't feed leaves to lions. Another book I would recommend on diet, and statistically, I think 90% of people have a fungus or parasite infection, which 9 out of 10 people, that's a lot. Not only is it a lot, but if you're in a room full of 10 people, then 9 of them statistically has some sort of parasite infection. I think that statistic was even revised late last year, maybe, and it is now 95 to 98% of people have fungal and or parasite infection. So there's lots of symptoms for a parasite infection: itchy bum, flaky skin, a lot of dandruff, night sweats, inflamed tissue, pain, inability to sleep, grinding of the teeth, clenching of the jaw, moods, brain fog. I remember in the book, The Fungus Link by Doug Kaufman, I think it's Kaufman. He goes on to explain that a fungal infection can mimic any disease, including cancer. So how the fungus will affect you is essentially they will eat the food before you do, then they will poo out the excrement that their bodies don't want, creating what are called mycotoxins, which typically affect the reproductive organs, prostate in male, sometimes ovaries in females, but often the uterus and the breasts and the lungs. And it can present as prostate enlargement or a lump in the breasts or something, polycystic ovaries or something like that. But really, it's actually a fungal infection. So a fungal cleanse would be very, very helpful for most people. I would do one probably twice a year just to clean myself out. And even being a pretty healthy guy like myself, you'd be amazed at what comes out. With a parasite infection, parasites will bore through the wall of the organ. That will create what's called an afferent drive. An afferent drive means inward drive from the organ through the central nervous system up to the brain. The brain will then go into complete repair mode. when you go into repair mode, often your digestion stops. Your capacity to rebuild tissue diminishes to the degree that you've got a quite severe parasite infection. Remember, fungus and parasites have the opposite circadian rhythm to us. So when it's midday for us, it's midnight for them. When it's midnight for us, it's midday for them. So while we're asleep, it's party time for them. That's why a lot of people can't sleep at night. With parasites as well, I think there's over 1,500 or 2,000 parasites that they've discovered, and about 150 are harmful to humans. Now, it's really common for people to go overseas to Asia, for example, where it's completely different nutritional profile, bacterial profile, and our system simply just can't. Not that we can't handle it, but we're just not used to it. It is so foreign to us. And for a lot of people, it's so foreign to us is because we don't have a great deal of variety in our own diet. Most people eat, I think on average, 8 to 12 foods their entire life. So as yummy as they may be, we're not getting the nutritional variety from the environment. Not only from the environment, but the seasons. So right now it's in the middle of winter in Sydney, but yet there's still bananas and pineapples and berries on the shelf, and they're typically summer fruits. How they're being grown or how far are they coming to be on your shelf. All of this impacts the nutritional value of the food. Not only that, but it also impacts your capacity to absorb the food. Now, certain foods are seasonal for a reason. One of the reasons in Mother Nature's infinite wisdom is certain fruits and vegetables contain certain nutrients. And you'll notice right around what Western medicine calls the flu season, which is just when it goes from hot to cold, there are abundance of fruits and vegetables coming into season that are packed with immune boosting nutrients. But those same foods start to go more dormant when it comes into summer, because in summer we need different nutrients according to the environment. So all of these foods that are available to us all year round, yes, it's convenient, but what's it really doing to our bodies? If we didn't have the convenience of supermarkets, then you'd really have to question, would we be better off if we were just to eat seasonal produce? Now, as an example, my heritage is Danish. So I came from a part of the world where, safe to say, a lot of the ground froze in winter. So you can't really grow anything in ice. And so my body responds to, especially when it's cold, not that it gets as cold in Sydney, but it's certainly cold enough to know it's not summer anymore. My body responds better to fermented vegetables and hot foods. So as an example, in wintertime, my diet is mostly 80 to 90% protein and fat. I don't need the vegetable matter. I have a little bit, but a very minute portion per day, if any at all. So that's my body. But I've had to form a relationship with my body, and I've had to get to know my body, have a relationship with it, learn the signals, learn the messages that my body says. And even if I ate a typical diet according to the food pyramid, I'd be a balloon. If I wasn't a balloon, I'd be sick and tired. I know that for a fact. So I did it a lot of my life growing up because that's what we were taught we were supposed to do. And of course, we got our nutritional advice from the doctors, who, I think the average doctor, I think their education is anywhere from 6 to 8 or 9 years to get a doctorate. I could be wrong, depends on the country as well and what they're studying. But oddly enough, it's funny, when Pete Evans got into a lot of trouble about giving nutritional advice as a chef, the doctors were putting shit on him. Yet out of that entire doctorate from doctor's education, they on average can learn nutrition in about 2 hours to 2 weeks, depending where they are in the world. So out of let's say a 6-year doctorate, a couple of hours or a couple of weeks in nutrition training. And that nutrition training, funnily enough, comes from chefs. So, oh, the irony. Now, for an overall complete kind of check to see where you're at, one of my first mentors and friend, Mr. Paul Check, I think he's written 11 books now, but for a really 101 dive into your own well-being from physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. One of the most famous books, How to Eat, Move, Be Healthy. It's got quite a comprehensive food section, quite a comprehensive posture section. You'll learn a lot more if you study through the IMS and the Czech Institute, go into a lot more detail with all of those things. If you do have How to Eat, Move, Be Healthy, there is a page on here which I refer patients and students to all the time, and it is page 48. And you'll see on page 48 what's called the tachometer. And that just really shows you long-term responses of carbohydrate, short-term responses to carbohydrate, long and short-term responses to protein if you've had too much or too little, likely symptoms you're going to experience, and ways to get rid of it, to correct that. Now, when you really think of it, unless you have a significant disease or you're an elite athlete and your nutrition needs to be absolutely spot on, that's really all you need to know about nutrition, unless you want to go deeper for your own curiosity, as an example. But when you get to a certain point, you know what your body wants day to day, week to week, season to season. You learn what your body wants. You know how it feels when you have certain foods. Society tells us that we should eat certain foods for this nutrient, certain foods for that nutrient, blah, blah, blah. But the reality of it is, if you can't absorb it, then it's actually creating inflammation in your system. That inflammation is going to set off any back pain you had, any shoulder pain, any organ dysfunction, skin, pick your poison. So whatever you've experienced previously in life, your diet can actually wake it all up again. So the best answer to the question, what should I eat, is anything that you can, essentially. Journey, it can be helpful to have a food diary. Just write down what you eat over a week as an example. Write down what you ate, how much of it you ate, what your bowel movements were like, how much water you drank, what your mental clarity was like, your emotional, how stable emotionally were you. And then you'll see a pattern emerge. And then that pattern is going to generally direct you into a direction of what your body wants. And that's just one simple way how you can form a relationship with yourself. And that's really the key to a lot of it. And typically, the sicker people are, the more out of touch of who and what they are. So they're just not in touch with themselves, really. They don't know themselves. They've given their power to let's call them experts. So that's why I never tell people what to eat, because it's a really dangerous thing to do. And if I do suggest foods for people, it is after quite a comprehensive assessment. The last 4 doctors you will ever need. So in Paul Chek's system, they talk about the last doctors, which is Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, Dr. Happiness, and Dr. Movement. Now, he got that from the Hippocrates 3 doctors, which was Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, Dr. Happy. And Paul added Dr. Movement because Western culture is relatively a lot more sedative than our ancestors were. So we can just put clothes into a washing machine, come back an hour later and it's all clean. But back in the day, you had to take your washing down to the river and physically put them on that pan roller thing. And that itself was a workout. So you didn't need to go to the gym back then. So, I mean, Dr. Diet, the food that you eat, your nutrition, your hydration that we just spoke about. Dr. Quiet, are your circadian rhythms in sync with the sun and the moon? Because our hormonal system is driven by our circadian rhythm. And usually the first thing that goes when we dip out of balance is our circadian rhythm. If our hormones aren't functioning correctly, I mean, there's a myriad of symptoms can be created from that. And the quickest way to reset your hormones is to get your circadian rhythms in sync and clean up the diet. Dr. Happy, well, such a big topic of finding what makes us happy in life. And unfortunately, most patients that I see ask them that question and they just shrug their shoulders. And it's quite sad because if, you know, you look at a kid playing, they could be playing in the mud, dirt, grass, wherever. They're just happy being there. And that seems to get beaten out of us as adults. And I try and remind patients all the time, what does the child want? What does play look like? And if they just shrug their shoulders, then they've just lost touch with their inner child. Sometimes the child just needs to play for absolutely no reason whatsoever, than just to unbound play with absolutely zero objective, play for the sake of playing, and just enjoy that for whatever it is, and just giving yourself permission to do that and then nothing else. The simplicity has become so complicated just in that concept alone. And if we can find what we do and love what we do, then it becomes a labor of love and not just a labor. Laboring takes energy, but a labor of love will sustain itself. Dr. Movement, well, we need to pump the body. You need to move it. A lot of us sit down all day in front of a computer, which sounds a bit hypocritical right now because I'm sitting down in front of the computer. But thanks for joining me on my first solo podcast. Please let me know how I did, and if there's any guests that you want me to bring on board for us to talk to and have a good little chat about, write them in the comments. Enjoy your day, everyone. Feel free to leave a nice little review or a comment and interact with us. Have a chat with us. We're here anytime, and look forward to sharing more next time. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Wizard and the Priestess. Thanks for stopping by.